This is Year 7, the Peasants' Revolt. This would have been a classroom lesson because you guys have had to go into lockdown. I've put this video on. So it's Year 7, Peasants' Revolt. So this is Year 7, and it's the lesson, the Peasants' Revolt. Now, what we're actually wanting to do in this lesson is analyse the different interpretations of the Peasants' Revolt. But before we can do that, really, we need to actually look at what the Peasants' Revolt actually is. So first off, the words. So peasants, hoping you know what peasants means. This is the lower rungs of society. So if you think back to that hierarchy we did before Christmas, that's what that refers to. Peasants are the people at the bottom. It includes people who we class as artisans, which is almost like the middle class, people like merchants, things like that. But it goes all the way down to the vile, who are your serfs, who are people who are basically tied to the land. They're basically slaves. Or at the very least like an indentured labour force. And then the word revolt. If you think of the word revolting, that you think that would mean something that's disgusting, something that you don't like, that you're supposed to reject. Revolts are where people just reject something en masse. Revolutions, similar word, similar etymology. It refers to people who are disagreeing with and rejecting, in this instance, the ruling society. So the peasants' revolt, they're rejecting the nobles and they're rejecting the king. Now, the Peasants' Revolt, why this came about, there's a few factors really that caused it. One of the big ones, as we've already looked at, is the plague. So what the plague did was wipe out vast numbers of people, up to 40%, well, potentially up to 40% in the UK, and maybe even as high as 50% in Europe worldwide. Now, one of the effects that this had as a result was a huge depletion of the number of peasants that existed. This meant that there was a massive reduction in the number of people able to do work. So skilled labourers, say stonemasons or carpenters, there were far fewer of those than there used to be. This then meant that they could charge higher premiums for their work. So they were able to charge more for their work because there aren't as many about. And because there aren't as many about, there's not as much competition for work. Even in the fields and the less skilled workmanship, so the miners and your farmers, they were still able to charge more because they're doing more work. There was more expectation and more stress that was put on them as a result of there being fewer people overall. Now, what this sort of meant was that they could claim more against the nobility. The nobility didn't like this at all. Also, at the same time, if you remember, the nobility in England have historically, we've always been at odds with France. And around the time of the Peasants' Revolt, there was a war that was breaking out in France, and they wanted to find money and raise money to be able to finance that war. And this is where the poll tax was brought in. So poll tax is where you were charged for your land and what you own. This levied money specifically against peasants to help finance the war that the nobles were wanting to fight. Now, even today, well, we don't call it a poll tax anymore, now we call it a council tax, but it's something that still exists today, only today that money goes towards things like bin men, fire services, police force, things like that. It's things that help to keep the society running. So if you think that poll tax, though, back then was just being used to fight and to raise an army, to fight in a war that none of the peasants really cared about, perhaps they didn't even really agree with in the first place, and they don't really have much of a choice about it. So Peasants' Revolt kicks in as a result of this. So all of this came to a head in 1381. So in May 1381, in Essex, which is in the southeast of England, there was a poll tax collector that was going around who was trying to collect the money. This was completely rejected. People had had enough of it, and they just basically told him no and refused to pay the taxes at all. And this sort of triggered off a huge confrontation, and this started to spread across the whole of the southeast. And it covered a large areas, so it was huge areas of the rural societies that just upended and just said, no, we're not doing this anymore, we're not standing for it. There were villages that started to do it and refused to just take part in it in general. It built up to something more than just a rejection of the poll tax. It actually brought up a load of peasants who wanted to see a change in the fundamental way that England was governed. And it wanted an end to unfree labour. So as I mentioned earlier, you had serfs. What a serf was, it was someone who, if you imagine nowadays, you guys were born in Leek. Leek would have been the area where you have to live. And so you would have had a lord that was in charge of Leek, and you are effectively beholden to him. You are not allowed to leave Leek without his permission. You have to work in the areas that he says. You are a serf. That means you're bound to that area of land. And this was something you were forced to do. So usually you'd have to work on his fields for a certain number of days because you're born in Leek. Then you'll have like your own little plot of land, which is what you grow your own food off. And this is how these things have very much been set up since the Romans had left, really. And they also called for the removal of King Richard II's senior officials and law courts. So they were really wanting to cut away a lot of the people from like the upper nobility from being able to govern things. They wanted to get rid of the serfdom rules, which was the whole fundamental way of how we govern things now. This is actually the equivalent to, if you think of the Houses of Parliament now, where the Prime Minister sits, it is like someone saying, no, we want to get rid of the Houses of Parliament. It's a massive, massive change to the way that England is supposed to be running. Now, there were a few other things as well that were causing this. So there was a cleric, I believe it was called John Ball. He had been, prior to this actually, he had been preaching this end to serfdom, because the idea of it being that people weren't free this way. And Wat Tyler, who was originally he was actually from Kent, but once the resistance and the revolt spread to Kent, he kind of took charge of it, and he became one of the main leaders of the peasants' revolt itself. And he actually took to marching an army of peasants up to London. And they were met by representatives of the royal government, who unsuccessfully tried to persuade them to return home to Kent, but they refused because they wanted to see a change to the whole legal system. Then King Richard, and bear in mind King Richard back in these days, he was only a teenager, he was only around the same age as you guys, he retreated to the safety tower of London because this was a big army of peasants that was coming their way. And unfortunately, most of the army were either getting ready to go over to France because of the taxes that were paid, or else were up in northern England because that was somewhere where it was seen as far less stable. Southeast of England, which is where all these revolts were going on, ironically was seen as a very safe part of England, so they'd never really kept very many soldiers there. Anyway, eventually the rebels enter into London, and they're joined by a lot of the people in London, because this is a very popular movement. So by entering London, which back then was the biggest city as it is today of England, the movement gets even bigger still. They go and they attack the jails, they go and attack the Savoy Palace, which was where the king would have been originally, and they set fire to a load of other buildings and cause a lot of chaos. The nobility, understandably, is extremely nervous about this. A lot of them start fleeing London. And those in governments as well are also trying to flee and get their families out. So eventually what ends up happening is Richard meets the rebels, and he basically agrees to most of their demands. Despite this, though, a lot of violence still breaks out from the peasants. They still go around and start trashing a lot of London. So Richard, and as big a force as he can get, go and they meet them again, kind of like the beginning of a battle. And what would traditionally happen in battle is the two leading forces of each side will go and meet in the middle and see if they can negotiate terms. If they can't negotiate terms, then they go back to the respective sides and the battle breaks out. So in this instance, though, what happens is Wat Tyler and King Richard and their entourage go into what's called no man's land, but then Richard just kills Wat Tyler. And after having killed him, after having killed the leader of the peasants' movement, he's then actually able to persuade the rest of the rebels to go home and end it. So this is really what's seen as the end of the peasants' revolt. There is a lot that happens after that. There's more of the ringleaders that get basically captured and executed, but essentially it's seen as an end. Now, what we're looking at with regards to the lesson, now that you've got the backstory of it, is assessing the interpretations of the peasants' revolt. Now, interpretation, what we mean by this is a point of view. So you can have a figurehead, a person, or a concept, and two people can have different views, and neither one is necessarily wrong. So as an example of interpretation, Winston Churchill is seen by the British as a hero of the Second World War. He's seen as the person who played a massive part in defeating Adolf Hitler, and so we think of him as a great hero for getting rid of this person and stopping fascism from spreading across the world. However, in India, Winston Churchill is seen as a horrible racist person who induced famine and basically is a genocidal dictator. Not actually much better than Hitler. In fact, there are some people in India who argue that Hitler was actually better than Winston Churchill because of the blockades that he set up to stop food getting into India during the Second World War. Now, both of these two opinions are true. What Winston Churchill did to the Indians is true, and what Winston Churchill did against Adolf Hitler is true. Yet, those interpretations are massively different. And this is where perspectives come into play. So taking the perspectives that we've actually got, and you've got a source pack which is attached to this, this video, there are very few accounts of the rebellion from the perspective of the peasants. Why is this the case? Why do you think this might be the case? Please pause the video here and write down some of the reasons as to why you think those perspectives are one-sided. So there aren't very many from the peasants, they're mostly from the nobility and the people who work directly for the nobility. Okay, the reason why, there's a couple of reasons why. One, the history is always written by the victors. So people who win are the people who always get to write the stories. There was a few years ago, there was First World War video footage which became colourised, and it was quite popular. It's still available now on BBC. All of it, or almost all of it, is from the Allied side, so it's the British, the French and the Americans, and their attitudes and their fighting. There isn't hardly anything, I don't think, of the German side and their fighting. Now, this isn't because Peter Jackson, who made the videos, didn't want to get footage of the Germans. It's just because when we won the war, we destroyed the footage because we were dictating, as the winners, what the history was going to look like. So, same rule applies with this. Because King Richard was successful in getting rid of the rebellion, he gets to determine what accounts were kept of the rebellion. Another factor is the majority of the people who were rebelling are peasants. Very few people back in those days could actually read and write. The majority that could were either clergymen or nobility, and a huge component of the contingent of the clergy are people who are either friends with or family members of nobility. So this means that the people who are writing it, who actually are able to write it, are majorically people who are on the winning side, not on the peasant side. And these are probably the two biggest factors as to why there are not very many accounts. Another factor is that the peasants who are able to read and write are going to be the more educated and the more successful. These are also more likely to be the ringleaders and leaders in general of the peasants' revolt. Most of these people would have been rounded up and executed. So the few people that the peasants did have that would be able to write accounts of the story were most probably executed. Now, another thing to consider is richer landowners who were educated needed the peasants to continue paying them. So if the richer landowners who were educated needed peasants to continue paying them, what might their perspective be on the peasants' revolt? Are they likely to think of this as a positive thing or a negative thing that the peasants are revolting? Because bear in mind, the peasants revolting means they are rejecting the landowners, refusing to pay them. So it's not in that landowner's interest for that peasants' revolt to be seen as glorified in any way, because if that revolt is seen as a great glorious thing, it's more likely another rebellion is going to break out again, which means that landowner, one, might get killed in the process, but he's also not going to be able to get his land worked, he's not going to be able to sell any of the goods, and he's not going to be able to charge money from the peasants. Now, another thing that people were afraid of, not just the nobility, but a lot of peasants were as well, was the end of the feudal system. This was a whole chain of government, and not only was it a chain of government, but it was one that was kind of seen as sanctified by God, because we had the natural hierarchy of men, with God at the top, then Pope, then the king below him, and the nobility below them, and then the lower nobility below them, and so forth. So a lot of what people were arguing for was the end of this system in general. So some people saw maybe this was a rejection of God. Some people had no idea what was going to happen as a result. One of the biggest concerns that people had during the Russian Revolution, which is something you'll learn about when you go to Key Stage 4, so that's high school, people were most afraid in Russia during this time, because when communists came in, it wasn't just that they were bringing new ideas, it was that they were going to completely change the way that that country was set up and governed. People didn't have the concept of what a non-feudal society looks like, because every single experience that they've ever had, any other cultures or even countries that they go to, all operate in the same way. So people were absolutely terrified of it. And the people who were most scared were the nobility. Because the way that the feudal system works is there's a handful of people, the nobility, who get to scrape off all the wealth and excess from the hard work of the peasants. This means that those nobility get to live a really cushy sort of life where they get to have parties and hang out and just enjoy themselves, go on the odd war, whereas the peasants are day in, day out constantly working and just eking out a living and just about scraping by. So the nobility, it's in their interest to carry the system on, whereas a lot more of the peasants are going to be reluctant to do that. That's not to say that there weren't peasants that supported it, but understandably, a rejection of the feudal system is going to come from the peasantry. So now you have 4 tasks. So you have to answer these 4 some are questions, some are statements that are posed to you. So the first one is, what was the Peasants' Revolt? So with this I want you to explain what happened, why it happened, and what were some of the events that went around it. So what was the Peasants' Revolt? The second is that for each interpretation of your source pack, which is again attached to this on Teams, that you've sorted, explain what you think makes that source positive or negative. So each one is going to have a positive spin or a negative spin. Has it got a positive or negative? Why do you think that? The third one is to pick a good interpretation and a bad interpretation in that source pack. Why do you think these may be different? I'll give you a clue. Look at the author. So the author is going to be a bit of a giveaway. If it's Lord blah 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 blah, it's more likely to be negative, isn't it? Where if it's a common person or a peasant, it's more likely to be positive about the Peasants' Revolt. And then your fourth one, why might a medieval lord have a different opinion than a modern historian? And use your knowledge of history to help with this. And just as a little bit of a clue with that, what biases, so why might a medieval noble want to keep the feudal system going, and why might a modern historian not be invested and not be interested in keeping the feudal system going?